Welcome to the Humble Hoof podcast. My name is Alicia Harlov. This is a podcast for both horse owners and hoof care professionals, offering discussions into various philosophies on the health of the hoof and soundness of your horse. Please check us out on Facebook or at thehumblehoof.com. A special thank you to our wonderful sponsor, Cavallo. For our Humble Hoof listeners, they are offering 15% off their Cavallo Trek hoof boots using the coupon code HRN at checkout. The Trek is the world's most popular and versatile hoof boot and Cavallo's toughest trail boot, while also doubling as an option for therapy or rehab. The front closure system makes it easily adaptable to various hoof shapes, and TPU upper design allows for maximum strength while minimizing weight for the comfort and ease of movement for your horse. These are recommended by vets and trainers and also loved as transport boots by barrel racers, show jumpers, dressage riders, and everyone in between. Again, for 15% off a pair of Treks, use the code HRN at checkout at cavallo-inc.com. I first heard about Alexa Linton from her Whole Horse podcast, and I really became fascinated with her approach to alternative therapies for horses. So when I reached out to her and talked to her about being on the podcast, at first I was thinking alternative therapies for horses, but then I realized that I really wanted to talk to her about keeping ourselves healthy as hoof care providers and how can we keep our bodies safe and prevent injury. And she did a really great job chatting with me about that. Yeah. So tell us a little bit about how you got into osteopathy and about your journey in that.
Yeah, well, it's been quite a journey. I actually started with a Bachelor of Science in Kinesiology, and then I became an equine sport therapist and worked on horses for a chunk of years. So graduated from that in 2005. So that's been a part of my journey, and one reason I work so much with horse people. And then I went into a lot of different energy medicine and animal communication and all sorts of stuff in that realm. And then I came back to osteopathy. That would have been in 2016. I wanted to kind of up-level my treatments and my education. And so I took a 5.5-year program in osteopathy in Vancouver. And that's human-based osteopathy. And in Canada, it's an unregulated profession. So here I'm called an osteopathic manual practitioner rather than like an osteopath. And so that's sort of a distinction here. I know in the States there's like DOs, like Doctor of Osteopathy. So so that was my journey. So 5.5 years of study in that, and I've been practicing for the last 3.5-ish, I think. Yeah, something like that, or 3 years. And I practice from home, and I work with a lot of horse people, as you can imagine, doing osteopathy. And essentially defining it is a real interesting one. I still haven't totally perfected my elevator speech on it at all, because it's such a varied practice. The main thing that I've really distilled from my education, 3 years in practice, as well as a bunch of professional development and continuing education, is that ideally what we're working with is freeing up the fullest expression of health. So it's a very whole body approach. So for anybody who's had any sort of myofascial work, like Heller work or Rolfing, or any sacral therapy, that all comes from a root in osteopathy. So it's really this sense of we look at the whole picture, and we are trained to kind of not jump on symptoms. We look at like what's happening in the whole body. Yeah. So that's a Cole's notes on osteopathy. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. And actually, I was going to ask you to define it. So you just did that anyway. And I don't know if it's more recognized or popular in Canada, but I haven't really heard of any in my area here. Because a friend in Canada actually told me like, oh, you should find an osteopath to work on like X, Y, and Z. And I tried to Google it, and it didn't seem like there was anything that like just readily popped up. I don't know. Is it similar to like a functional medicine practice or anything like that?
It's really interesting. There's not a lot that's like it that I have discovered. I've worked with lot of body workers, and for myself, my body's been a pretty interesting, meat suit to hang out in for this lifetime, and so I've like tried a lot of things, and there hasn't been anything that I particularly can say, well, this is just like this. I think there's the neural movement has similarities, and like I said, like Heller work, Rolfing, there's definitely similarities. Yeah, it is, they are hard to find. The thing is, the education is long, it's hard, it's expensive. and yeah, like in my town, for example, on Vancouver Island, I am the only one in my town that has a 4+ year training. And there's another one like 25 minutes away one direction, another one a half an hour away in the other direction. And yeah, so we are relatively a little more challenging to find, and I think in the States probably even more so. In Canada, there's quite a few schools, and it's becoming more and more recognized for people as a really helpful modality. Yeah. So
that's awesome.
I hope you find someone.
Yeah, well, that's a little bit about what I wanted to talk to you today about. Is, obviously as a hoof care provider, I'm really aware of my body and that it takes a beating doing this job. Like we're yanked around by horses every single day. And it's not even necessarily these horses that are badly behaved. It's that these horses are in pain. We're working on rehab cases. They can't physically hold up their own weight all the time. And then they end up leaning on us. So we are sore, or I get sore, especially now in the winter. I feel like I'm feeling it more this year.
Yep.
So, you said you work with some equestrians or equine people. So what are some common issues that you see with people that are working with horses?
Yeah, so it's super interesting. I love working with equestrians and non-equestrians, like just horse people in general, obviously, because you can like have chats about horses while you're working, which is really fun. And I also find them very interesting because often if someone's an equestrian, so I'm a rider. I also trim my 3 mares' feet, so I have a sense of like, yeah, how physically demanding it is to trim. Like I'm kind of like a 6 hoof limit person in a day, and I'll often just do 2 and be like sweating. And so I'm always completely in awe of hoof care providers and what you're able to do in a day, especially with horses that are more challenged or struggling holding up their feet, or these various things. So for me, when I see people come in, so oftentimes I have a few hoof care providers in my care, and one of the things I see often is potential concussions, definitely lower back stuff, more like overuse type injuries like carpal tunnel, elbow, shoulder, lower back, and hips, like I say. So those tend to be like the areas. Obviously, if someone's had an accident or they've had an actual injury working, that's a whole different matter. And they may have like a specific area that's like, okay, they had a horse step on them, or they had a kick or whatever it was, and then we sort of address that as we go. The number of horse people with foot stuff also, and I know most of us are like whatever foot stuff, but it actually has like a really big impact on the rest of the system. So when we get stepped on or whatever, that can actually like translate up into the rest of the body in interesting ways that we don't often think about. Yeah. So those are some of the things. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And it's interesting. I mean, obviously, I do have the low back stuff. I think that's pretty common, as like much of our days are sort of like spent bent over, as awful as that sounds. And then the like foot stuff, I don't know if this is correlated to that, but I have over the years had to switch like what kind of shoes I wear, and I've alternated between like corrective insoles to like trying like barefoot shoes and doing all these different things. And honestly, like you were saying, what I wear and what I put on my feet does impact like how my body feels. And I've noticed a direct correlation with that. And then something that I've seen that I don't know if you've seen this a lot with farriers or hoof care providers is lately this winter, my elbows and my shoulders have been bothering me.
Yep.
So, and I haven't gotten to the bottom of that yet, but I figure, we're using our arms a lot. So it's
Yeah,
not really a
yeah, for
surprise.
sure. For sure. And like I hope it's okay to kind of geek out today for your listeners a little bit, because there's a few areas that we don't often think of as possible influences on our health stuff, and our pain, right? So yeah, I wanted to share that with you. So number one, with the feet, like when we're horse people, our feet are kind of a, like a little bit like targets sometimes depending on our horses. And so we have all these bones in our feet. And oftentimes when we get stepped on, those bones may, shift the way that they're moving. They're maybe not move so freely. They may not want to, do all of their mobility stuff. And so so say we're walking, we'll have different pains because, say the arches aren't truly doing the thing that they're meant to do, for example. And so we're having to just compensate a little bit or change our gait a little bit to kind of, okay, well, that feels better. And, if I walk like this, or if I put insoles in, or if I do this, then I'm okay. But you can imagine the kind of ripple effect that can happen up into the knee and the leg and up the body. So that's one thing that's important to think about, and one reason to get your feet worked on.
Yeah.
It's far from everything, but it's also very impactful for our balance and our stability, and just our, the rest of the body, being healthy and well. So that's a pretty important one.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's one thing I always try to bring people's attention to. And people love getting their feet worked on because they just don't get worked on a lot of the time. They kind of get left out. The other thing to realize is that there is, and many people will know this, we have, the fascial system in our body. And depending on whether we get body work often or not, and this is something I see with a lot of horse people, is they'll get their horse's body work, but they won't get themselves body work, right?
Yeah.
They'll kind of
Right.
do what they need to do for their horse, and they're not getting regular body work. And as a farrier or a hoof trimmer, I would suggest thinking of yourself like you're an athlete.
Yeah.
And for your job, you're an athlete. What you do is very challenging and very physically demanding, and it requires consistent, like if you were, I don't know, in a professional sports league, for example, you would be getting access to massages and chiro and like all these other athletic therapy, all these things, and as well as cross training and that sort of thing to support you to do your job, right? And that's often not the case for hoof care providers. They're like heading out there, and I've worked on some where they've never gotten body work before in their life, which is like amazing that they still are able to do what they do. And with this fascia, we know now that it's one system. It's like one of my teachers calls it the fascia pajama. So it's one system of connective tissue that is around, inside, investing in, and surrounding all of our structures, like bone, muscle, tendons, ligaments, organs, brain, you name it, spinal cord, all of it. So if we took all that other stuff out, we'd be this we'd have a full outline of ourselves in fascia, which is like completely united, one piece. So when that fascia pajama, as my teacher talked about, starts to get tight, which it does, as say we're not drinking a lot of water, we've had, I don't know, some surgery, or we've had an accident or injury, or other things are going on in our system, that changes the quality, the gliding motion, the freedom of the fascia pajama, of this, like, all of our fascia. And we get what I consider like how it feels in my body is like my vacuum, like the vacuum seal that you can get like around meat starts to get like really tight.
Yeah.
I start to feel just like everything's like too tight in that internal system. And what will often start to happen when that's going on we'll start to notice little symptoms. Like we'll start to notice, oh, I'm getting numbness in one of my fingers, when I do this movement or when I sleep, or I'm starting to get elbow stuff or wrist stuff. The arms are super, super important for the fascia. And they're kind of they're often like, oh, it's an arm. It's not, the rest of the body, but it's actually really, really dialed into all the myofascial chains. So when the fascia pajama starts to tighten or there's like a holding somewhere, we start to feel it oftentimes in our limbs, in our fingers, in our elbows, in our wrists. And so it's something really important to think about as how am I taking care of this, this meat sack of mine and the things that are going on within it. And if I've had, big injuries, if I've had surgeries, if I've had, other concussions, falls on my tailbone, ankle sprains, like, am I getting those things addressed? Because if our job is to be physical, that's super critical that we're taking care of our body in the best way possible. So that's another thing. And the third thing I wanted to point out on the anatomy lesson side of things is a tissue called the dura or the dura mater. And if you've listened to my Whole Horse podcast, you may have heard an episode with myself and Elise Miki, and we talked about this one because the dura is one of those things we don't even really learn is in the body oftentimes, but it's super, super impactful on the spine, on the lower back, and just generally on our like flexibility. It also, so basically the dura is a continuous membrane that unites the cranial meninges and the spinal meninges. And its job, it's a very, very dense inflexible connective tissue, and its job is to protect the brain and the spinal cord. And I'll often describe it to my clients kind of like, Carhartt jackets, like the canvas, the really tough canvas, like kind of that feel, really, really strong. And when you see it in, say, a dissection, it's like actually hard to cut through with a scalpel. So this is surrounding the spinal cord, surrounding the brain, and it goes all the way from just a little bone called the ethmoid that's just under our nasal bone and lacrimal bone, and goes all the way down to the sacrum continuously. And it's impacted by a lot of different things. It can be impacted by stress and, like I said, dehydration and surgery and falls on the tailbone, concussions, all these sorts of things it can be impacted by. So it's one of those ones that I like to point out to people, because when I started osteopathy, I would get migraines every month just before my cycle. And I was like, what is going on? And I thought, of course, it must be hormonal. Like, that's got to be it. And then I realized once I got into osteopathy, I was like, oh, this is dura. Because the uterus is connected to the sacrum, every time that my body would start to shift towards my cycle, things would change and I'd get a pull on my dura, which would affect the blood flow through my cranium and through my brain. And once the dura started to be addressed, I don't have migraines anymore, but it like the improvement was significant and almost immediately as soon as that tissue was being addressed. And I would say that I find tight dura on like almost 100% of my clients, because like we live in a stressful world. Many of us are dehydrated. Many of us have had impacts that impact that tissue. Yeah. And it's one of those things that we don't often think about that can be having like a far-ranging effect on our overall health, vitality, well-being. So something I just kind of put out there to people is like, yeah, if you can get in with an osteo or work with someone who knows how to address that tissue level, it's a very helpful thing. Yeah.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And obviously, like, you sort of answered another question I had of, do you have any recommendations? You mentioned like getting your feet looked at and getting body work or trying to find an osteopath. Are there any exercises that like either equestrians or farriers, hoofcare professionals can do to help to minimize the damage we're doing to our bodies?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so like a couple things that I love. Number one, if you haven't looked up like the neuroscience behind movement yet, that is like a must, I think, for all people that are using their bodies. And I think all humans, it would be good. But just the sense that if we're using our bodies to do amazing things like riding and doing hoof trimming, these are like complex actions. Then learning about neuroscience is a really big one. And learning about functional movement is also a really big one, because what often happens is we don't necessarily cross train. We go do the thing we do, and then we're like really tired, and it's like, I don't want to do anything else. And I found doing that, I had a really bad back injury. I don't know, this would have been like 15, 16 years ago. I bulged a disc in my lower back, and it was horrible. And I was very stubborn at the time, and I didn't rehab it properly, as many of you may relate to. And it like really lasted a long time, and would come back usually with really stressful parts of my life. And I realized that I couldn't do after that, like the kind of usual cross training that I was used to. Like I was used to like running and riding a bunch and riding hard and doing things that like involved like jumping and stuff. And I wasn't able to do that anymore. And I was really, really having a hard time building strength back into my body, because everything seemed to trigger my injury. And so one of the things I discovered was functional movement. Essentially, there's one website that I absolutely love. I did quite a few of their programs called GMB, and they work with animal type movement. So you're emulating various like animal type movements, but what it does is it recruits. It's essentially working with like the neuroscience of movement. It's creating new neural pathways and allowing our bodies to kind of understand how to move in functional ways, where we're engaging a lot of different, not in a heavy duty way, but like engaging a lot of coordination in the movement. And I found it was the one thing that I could do without like re-injuring my back that actually allowed me to proceed and continue my rehab in a good way. So that was one thing that I love. So it'd be something for people, they may want to check that out and just explore that avenue of things. Another one for me is I do a little exercise program called, what is it called? Kinstretch. I really, really like it. And it works with controlled articular rotations at the joint level. And it's about exploring, again, in a neuroscience lens, the full range of motion of the joints. And very often, so for example, in the hip joint has essentially 3 planes of motion. We have flexion extension, we have abduction adduction, and then we have external rotation, internal rotation. But very often the main parameter of movement that we use is the flexion extension. So, even when we ride, yes, we get some abduction, so our leg coming out, and some external rotation. So riders actually have like more hip mobility than most of the population, just because we're using the range of the coxofemoral joint more than most. But we still don't specifically train the joint spaces and all of the essentially like mechanoreceptors and the neuroreceptors around those joint spaces and coordinating those movements. We don't train those very often, and so we often will miss aspects of that range. And what we'll find is those parts of the range become almost like in the brain on the neural maps, they become kind of like a bit fuzzy. Like the body's like, how do I do that again? And we want those to be crystal clear. We want the body to know, oh yeah, right, I can move in external rotation of the coxofemoral joint, no prob. I've got this, and it's strong and it's steady and controlled, and we're good. Because when the body then moves into those ranges when we're not expecting it, so a horse, drops their leg, or we have to move it out of the way really quick, or whatever it is, our body already knows, oh yeah, right, I can do that. I got that. I know how to do that, right? So we want to train those things first, ideally. And that includes the range of motion of the spine. I see it all the time where people have really, really poor mobility in their spine, and they're not using their spine in all the ranges. So the spine, again, flexion, extension, rotation, and side bending is the parameters, the movement parameters of the spine. And we're not always utilizing and actually training at all levels of the spine, you know, all of those movement parameters. And that's really critical to actually prevent injury, is when the brain knows, oh, I can be there, no problem. I don't have to brace. I'm strong in those spaces. It actually really, really supports us to, to reduce like the possibility of injury, essentially, by the body feeling like it can do the things, you know, because otherwise, if we haven't been in those spaces, oftentimes there'll be a brace that happens, or, you know, another thing that occurs to try to, or a compensation that happens, because it's like the body's like, I don't know how to do that. So exploring movement is one of the things that I suggest to all of my clients, because at the end of the day, you can get as much body work as you want, but this is like the way that you support your long-term health and well-being. And the fascia loves it, the dura loves it. You know, you're supporting circulation in your system, you're supporting lymph movement, you know, all the good stuff that you know we want and need are supported by movement practice. It's one reason for me that I love to dance. And I do a type of dance called 5 rhythms, and it's like totally free. It's like not choreographed. So I can really listen to my body and like, how does my body want to move? And, you know, what spaces does it want to move into? And I can explore these different ranges of motion in a fun and playful way, because very often we get stuck in like, you know, this is how I move and that's it. And so the curiosity around the love of movement is something that I hope more and more people cultivate in their day-to-day life. Yeah. So.
Yeah. And that makes so much sense, because I've always worried about, you know, is this something that's just inevitable? Like, is it inevitable that every single farrier or hoof care provider is going to end up with the same repetitive strain injuries that we all get because our job is taxing on those parts of the body? So that is, you know, that kind of answers my curiosity into that of like, what can people do to sort of prevent it before these issues happen, and like explore like how we can prepare our bodies to do a job that's, you know, otherwise taxing. So yeah, that was really great. Thank you.
Oh, you're so welcome. Yeah. It's such an interesting conversation, because it's like, yeah, like, you know, I think, and you've probably felt it and seen it in others. It's like we can really get kind of stuck in a bit of a rut in our movement.
Absolutely.
And then we end up like moving the same way all the time, right? I always like, one of the things I'll do with my clients, I'm like, okay, we're now entering the ministry of silly walks. Like if you've seen Monty Python, you get it. And I'm just like, okay, like I want you to take 10 strides on your walk, and like, you know, and I'm gonna like get you to do like ministry of silly walks. I want you to like salsa walk, or I want you to, you know, do whatever, something different, right? Add something different in, because, you know, the number of people that don't have good dissociation between, say, their thorax and their hips, it's like almost everybody that gets on my table, right? Because they don't allow themselves to move in silly ways. When we were kids, we would just kind of be goofy and like let ourselves like do silly movement, and then we get to be adults and we get, you know, a bit more like, oh, we don't want to do things that might make us look weird, right? And I encourage weird, you know, like that. Letting your body move the way it wants to move, and finding a joy in movement is truly like, because I think what happens is many of us get scared to move, right? Like it's like, oh, well, that elbow hurts, so I don't want to move it anymore. Like, or, you know, I'll protect that, or, you know, and then what ends up happening is you get this cascading compensation impact, and, you know, like, because I don't use this knee, so then I have to do this, and, you know, whatever it is, right? So when we explore movement more and more, and explore fluidity more and more, it's a really big image that I try to bring in for people, is like, we're meant to be fluid. We're meant to be fluid. We're meant to be flowing. We're meant to be gliding. We're meant to be hydrated. What does that feel like and look like in all the tissues of our body?
Yeah.
Right?
And
Yeah.
it's so funny how much this lines up with like even how we care for and train horses. Like obviously we
Yes.
wouldn't, there's a lot of cross training that goes on with horses. We don't just drill them in one circle every single day and do the exact
Exactly.
same thing every single day. And at the same time, like what you're saying sort of reminds me of like my soapbox sort of is like horses need turnout and free movement for their bodies to be healthy. They can't just like live in a stall and then go exercise for an hour a day. But that sort of correlates to what you're saying for us too, is that like we need to be doing things that aren't just our normal everyday, like same routine. Yeah.
Absolutely. And isn't it ironic that like so many horse people are so scared of turning their horses out? They're also so scared of moving their own body, in more free ways. Right. So like it makes sense, but yeah, like, when you look at things, like the thing that jumps to mind is Panther Flow, right? With Kathy Sierra. It's like, okay, that like she's talking about neuroscience and neuromovement. It's, and there's been a lot of controversy about that because it's a new thought. It's a new way of thinking. But when we look at, say, like horse keeping, it's like, I want my horses to be moving over weird ground and to be doing stuff that challenges their movement parameters. To be up and down hills and to be on different footing. This allows those proprioceptive receptors, those mechanoreceptors to start turning on, to light up, so that we actually do our injury prevention in our daily life, because we're exploring movement. And the body feels more and more comfortable and confident with, you see these guys like jumping off buildings, literally, like, doing these huge things that you're like, how on earth are they doing that? Like breaking their legs, or like there's people that are doing things that are like beyond what we can comprehend. And the reason is that they've trained their body and their fascia to be confident and to really bring forth the potential of what the body can do, right?
Yeah.
And that, I think, is truly the key, that each one of us can do that, because it's about just nudging the edges of our possibility. Not, we don't need to jump into what they're doing. Absolutely not. We're where we are. But what is possible, being curious about what's possible for us in those spaces is, I think, one of the most important things. And especially if we want our body to keep doing cool stuff for a long time, right?
Yeah. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. All right. Well, I just had, one more question for, if you have any tips or last minute tips for hoof care professionals to keep themselves healthy for the long term. Like, how can we keep doing the job that we love? And obviously this was kind of what this whole episode is about, but is there anything that you like really want to drive home?
Okay, I've said it a few times here, but make sure to hydrate. And
I will say I'm really, really bad at hydrating. So
I know, and
I will take that out of this.
Right? A lot of people are, especially if you're on the road a lot. And it's like, you don't want to be peeing all the time. I get it. But it is super important, especially if you want those tissues to stay happy. Diet as well. Like, I'm not a nutritionist. I'm not going to say what or where, but like concentrating on your diet, it makes a huge difference in your inflammatory levels. It's really important. So, find yourself a professional that you can work with. Make it a priority. This was something for me. I got really, really sick a couple of years ago, to the point of, not good. And I lost over 25 pounds, and I'm a little tiny person, so that was not good. And it took a long time to build that back up. And it also created this huge awareness in me of like how precious our health is, how absolutely precious our health is, and how critical it is for us to put in the work to maintain it as best as we possibly can. And, I know for a lot of us, we'll skip meals, or we'll eat, on the run, or, we'll not sleep enough, or we won't drink water, or like whatever it is, or we'll stay in like high stress levels for really long times. These are all things that when we start, I know for myself, like I'm just glad to be alive. And so I had to start prioritizing my health, which means I go to bed at 9:30 at night. I sleep for 8 to 9 hours. I eat really, really well for what I need. And I make sure that the things that are necessary in terms of like reducing my stress levels are happening, because I want my body to be able to do the things that I want to do for the long term. I'm a manual therapist, so it's, again, a physical job. So I have to prioritize that for myself if I want to keep going, and not just assume my body's going to do that, just keep on going without those things being addressed. So yeah, getting those foundations in place is actually really, really critical. And I know you've heard this a million times, everybody out there, and probably like, ugh, and it is really important. Yeah, take it from someone who's gone through a bunch of stuff and come out the other side. It's super duper important. So that would be what I would say. And yeah, find a body worker that you love, and go see them regularly, and make that make it a business expense and do it, because it will, be worth its weight in gold down the road. If you're thinking long term and you want to do this for a long time, that's the way you got to be thinking. Your body's a machine. We're not a machine, obviously, but if our body was a car, we want to think about keeping it well maintained, and body work and all these other things are a part of what does that. So yeah.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you so much for spending time chatting with me. This is all very, very interesting, and I'm excited to kind of implement some of this stuff, because it's things I hadn't even thought of that are like stuff that I apply to the horses that I'm rehabbing that I don't even think about for myself.
Totally. I mean, how much, like, how common is that in the horse world, right? It's like, right. I do all these things for my horses, and then I like, don't do that for me. So yeah, no, I totally get it. Awesome. Absolutely. No, it's been a pleasure chatting.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. All right. Awesome. So before we sign off, could you just, like, if people are interested in learning more and they want to chat with you or reach out to you, how would they get in touch with you?
Yeah, great question. So you can find me on Instagram and Facebook at Alexa Linton. I think my Facebook is Alexa Linton Fan. I don't check that one very often. But one of the most exciting things right now is my brand new website and company. It's called Outside the Box Equine.com. So that's the website, outsidetheboxequine.com. And you can come over there and you can reach me through there. And I also have some really cool online courses over there, including Build Your Horse Track System course.
Awesome.
So yeah, I invite you to come over and have a look. It's got 11 case studies of track systems, mainly here on the West Coast. So you can do track tours and check out. I've included information and details on all the elements that I see as critical for creating a great track. So that's over there, and you can email me from there as well. So I hope to hear from you.
All
okay.
Right. Well, thank you so much again, and I hope that you have a great rest of your day. I'm sorry that you're doing this while you're moving, but I really appreciate it.
Oh, I appreciate it as well. This has been a great chat. Thanks, awesome. Alicia.
All right, sounds good. See you later.
See ya.
Bye.
Bye.
I always say that I'm slightly more hoof obsessed than the average person, and chances are, if you're listening to a hoof care podcast, you are too. So we should probably be friends. Feel free to find me on Facebook or email me at thehumblehoof@gmail.com.